Hey, what's going on YouTube? Charlie here, and today I wanted to talk to you about the breakup of the Beatles, one of my all-time favorite bands, hands down, no questions asked. And I feel like when a lot of people think about the breakup of the Beatles, they think about Yoko Ono, and well, there's actually a lot of factors that go into the breakup of the Beatles, so let's just kind of back it up a bit. So Paul, John, and George all met each other in 1957, so they've been together for a pretty long time. And they, of course, had their residency in Germany between 1960 and 1962, where they played hundreds of hours, and they were so determined not to repeat themselves when they were performing. And a lot of people can argue that that's probably when the Beatles were at their absolute highest peak in their career, performance-wise. Spectacular time for the Beatles. But if you think about their 1963, 1964, the whole Beatlemania era, that was a lot of pressure for the Beatles. Constant touring schedule, constant television performances, radio performances, just interviews, very, very rigorous schedule. So they were pretty much kept away in their hotels when they were traveling, and they didn't really have a whole lot of luxury and freedom that the Rolling Stones had when they were touring, where they were pretty much free to roam and do whatever, and the Beatles were basically locked away in their hotel rooms. So, of course, that could, really affect someone's mental health, especially as we learned from lockdown, from COVID, that, all that isolation can really do a number on your mental health. So that certainly didn't help. And then as we continue on, we have to think of 1966. By this point, the Beatles were pretty much fed up with their touring, and they couldn't really hear each other live over the loud screaming, and live performance back then just wasn't the best for audio, so they couldn't really hear each other anyway. And let's see, so John Lennon he didn't accidentally, but the media pretty much took his words of saying that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and they took that and they blow it out of proportion, and that's pretty much the first instance of cancel culture, I believe, in my opinion. But he said his infamous statements about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, which I think really hurt their image a lot. And so 1966, we saw the Beatles recording their Revolver album, and they were pretty much done touring. And at this point, after they decided they were no longer going to tour, George had declared that he's no longer a Beatle. And because the whole Beatles were pretty much the touring group, and now that they were evolved into men, no longer the boys that everyone knew, but they are all men, serious artists, songwriters. So, but as early as 1966, I started to read that John Lennon had slowly lost his interest in the Beatles, and he was actually considering trying to quit, but he had no idea how to go about doing so. He didn't know how to bring it up with the guys, and I guess probably he just didn't know what else to do with his time. So he hunkered down, stuck with it, but then he became a regular acid user. He became very acid washed in 1966, 1967. So he slowly started to lose interest in the Beatles, and Sgt. Pepper was definitely a Paul McCartney dominated album, and there's a lot of downtime, boring time for the band. Ringo, he wasn't needed as much, and when he was finally needed, then that's where the magic would happen. The band grew increasingly impatient with George Harrison's love for the Indian music, and a lot of times he would mess up with his guitar solos, so then that would also frustrate the rest of the band, and it would frustrate George Martin, R.I.P. So a lot of times Paul McCartney had to take over on the lead guitar licks, or he would have to take over on the guitar solos. But yeah, I would say definitely after Brian Epstein, their manager, died in 1967, that was pretty much the Beatles realized that they were screwed at this point, because even though he was a few years older than John Lennon, Brian Epstein was a father figure to John. And he definitely held the band together. He was the glue. And the Beatles thought that they could try to manage themselves afterwards, and that just kind of became a disaster. And Paul McCartney had been working really hard on the Magical Mystery Tour film, and it was not received too well. And the timing of the movie release wasn't great either. I believe that was on December 26th. So the timing for that wasn't great. I enjoy the film. I've seen it a couple times. It's wacky. It's out there. But as a Beatles fan, I still recommend watching it. Up to you though. So then we come around to 1968. The Beatles, and they go off to India. They go drug free except for their weed. And Yoko at this point stays behind because John was still married to Cynthia, but their relationship was struggling. They were getting ready to divorce. And so John was very lonely there, and Ringo was having a hard time with the food, and I think Paul was pretty much over India, and John and George, they stayed there the longest, but then after rumors of the Maharishi being sexually inappropriate, the other two remaining Beatles were disgusted and they decided to fly home. And so there's a lot of tension during the White Album sessions, especially during like Hey Jude and Revolution. Paul McCartney was kind of pretty much bossing everyone else around, telling them what to do, and every time George would offer up a suggestion on how he would handle his lead guitar parts, Paul would just immediately shut him down and like put him in his place. And I believe during Revolution it was John who did not like George's guitar tones, so there was some frustrations there. I think the last time the Beatles really had like a fun session was before they went to India during the Lady Madonna and Hey Bulldog sessions. So that's probably like the last time that they really got together very well and had fun. Things just started to fall apart in India, and with the constant presence of Yoko in the studio, definitely put the band at odds against each other, and they were getting really frustrated, and they didn't like that. And sometimes she would open her mouth to make suggestions, and even John at this point is like, whoa, what are you doing, Yoko? What are you doing opening your mouth? Like, we're the Beatles, okay? In the Peter Jackson Get Back documentary, you can see Paul McCartney reading a newspaper with bad reviews over the White Album, and he was just like holding back tears, and he's angry, frustrated. And Ringo had abruptly quit the band during the White Album sessions for about 2 weeks, only to be brought back. And they'd even brought Eric Clapton into the studio in hopes that they could ease tensions, but Eric Clapton was like, whoa, I'm gonna like back off here. These guys are, I don't know what's going on with them. So there's definitely a lot of tension there. And the Beatles had tried launching their business Apple Corps, but that tanked, that bankrupt, and that wasn't good. But then as time went on, they started to kind of warm up to Yoko's presence in the studio. You can see it in the Let It Be and Get Back films that they actually seem to get along pretty well with Yoko at this point. But, you know, there's a lot of frustration as to like the band's direction, and George was very adamant about not performing live ever again. And you can see at one point, John and George are having discussions during the Let It Be Get Back sessions. And he just says, okay, you know what? I'm out. I'm done. I quit. So he just gets up and leaves. And then John just kind of left stunned, like, what? What just happened? You're leaving? What the hell? So Paul and John get together and they have discussions, and because they want to get George back in the band. And then 5 days later, George agrees to come back, and he lays out his terms and conditions. So they all compromise, and George is then back in the band. And then, of course, there's some more tensions going on, too. The Beatles are over off in a film studio, and it's very, very cold. And it wasn't where they normally write and record, and constantly having cameras in their faces definitely would hinder their creative abilities, all the anger and frustrations. But by the time they were working on Abbey Road, they said, all right, let's just start over, let's start fresh, let's get George Martin back on board, and let's shape up. Although sometimes Paul would still kind of like snap out at George, and he had these brilliant songs. He had Something, and he had Here Comes the Sun, and Paul would still offer up some suggestions on what to do for the bass parts for Something, and then George would snap back saying, you know what, this is my song, this is how it's going to go, we're going to play it like this, back off. And then that pretty much put Paul in his place, and they agreed to do things George's way. But yeah, no, there's just a lot in the Beatles' history that would overall lead up to the eventual breakup of the Beatles. And John would quietly walk away from the band, and he was going to privately tell the press in Disney World about the breakup of the Beatles, but Paul McCartney had pretty much beat him to the punch on that, and he announced the breakup, further angering John. And Paul had plans to release his debut album before the release of Let It Be, which I think is kind of like a jerk move. But yeah, so their relationships weren't great by this point. They still had like that brotherly companionship, of course, and they still, when they did get together to actually record, they still had a great time, a lot of fun. But, you know, with the constant touring and then stop touring, the death of their manager, and outside sources, Yoko coming in, talking to John, trying to help him move on from the Beatles, and Linda encouraging Paul to follow his musical endeavors, and George, they all wanted different directions for the band. They all had different sound styles that they were all experimenting with. And, you know, it's a shame, of course. Every fan would love to hear more music from the Beatles, and we'd all like to think about like what sort of songs that they would do together. But you can kind of like hear like some of the direction like the band was interested in going. Like you could hear like some of the songs that would inspire Paul to come up with Wings, and you can hear some songs that were inspired John to do the Plastic Ono Band, and you can hear some songs that would inspire George for the All Things Must Pass album. So all in all, absolutely love the Beatles. Fantastic band, spectacular. I really hope you enjoyed this informative video. If you do like what you see, please continue to like, comment, and subscribe. I wouldn't want you to miss the next video. You'll be the first to know if you do subscribe. Thank you all so much for viewing this, and we will see you on the next time.